Our book explores the meaning of sustainable transport and how we can all work to achieve it for our cities. Worldwide, transport is 98% dependent on fossil fuels and is therefore unsustainable. Fossil fuel transport is a major contributor to global warming, which will have devastating results if we don't collectively slow it down. Sustainable mobility in Australia must mean a gradual move towards zero-emission transport. But we have to start now. We have to get off the destructive, vicious cycle of road building, leading to traffic congestion, leading to more road building. We have to reinvent public and active transport as the cornerstone of sustainable mobility. In 2005, I and a group of people here applied to the Volvo Research and Education Foundations for a grant for a Centre of Excellence at the University of Melbourne, which we call GAMUT, which stands for Governance and Management of Urban Transport. And the GAMUT team worked for about 6 years on different aspects of the future of urban transport. Volvo wanted us to look 50 years into the future and just think about the long term and the global scope of transport. And this book is the outcome of those 6 years of research, and it contains work of all the team members essentially. Well, we started by looking at what we call the global dilemma of transport. And that's really important, and I don't think people have looked at this much. We tend to think of transport as something local, traffic jams, trains not running on time, poor services in Melbourne, here. But actually, transport is a global problem. And it's a global problem for the world economy, because the world economy depends on transport. When you think about it, $12 trillion worth of goods flowing around the world. That's what happens in the global economy. All of that is dependent on transport. Now the problem arises because all of that transport is something like 98% dependent on fossil fuel, and that means carbon emissions. So transport is a problem for the global climate in a big way. The world really has, during the 20th century, developed transport systems for cities based on cars. And that's private ownership of cars, and the costs of the transport systems were devolved on to individuals. Individually, we pay a lot for our transport in cities. We have to own cars, and cars are very expensive to own. Depreciation and servicing and registration and all that. So it's a very expensive transport option. And over the years we allowed our public transport options to simply run down. Very little public investment in public transport over the years. And the result is that they're now in fairly poor shape, really, and they need huge investment to bring them up to date. So to summarize, the consensus among climate scientists is that the Earth is now on track to 5 degrees of warming. So what will 5 degrees of warming mean for the future of humanity? Interrogating the scientific literature, Mark Linus tells us that at 5 degrees of warming, the remaining ice sheets are eventually eliminated from both poles. Rainforests have already burned up and disappeared. Rising sea levels have inundated coastal cities and are beginning to penetrate far inland into continental interiors. Humans are herded into shrinking zones of habitability by the twin crises of drought and flood. Inland areas see temperatures 10 or more degrees higher than now. Is this an extreme scaremongering scenario, or is this the future we are unwittingly setting in motion? All we know for certain is that greenhouse gases are being emitted faster than ever before. That is happening through human combustion of fossil fuel. The atmosphere is warming faster than ever before. We cannot afford to take the risk that Linus and the climate scientists might be right. Now, in a city like Melbourne, in our sort of low-density cities, the long-term future, you can either bring where people work and where they live to the transport system, the public transport system, or you can bring the public transport system to where people live and work. And the first option is not really going to work because you're going to have very high density in the inner urban areas of Melbourne, for example. Not many people want that, and I mean by inner urban areas not only the CBD but the big sort of surrounding areas in what they call the leafy suburbs of Melbourne, and people in the leafy suburbs don't want high density. So there's a political problem there and a lot of opposition to high density, which is understandable. But in addition to that, if you do have a very high density core, you also have to have a massively improved public transport system to service it. Our current public transport system couldn't possibly service the number of people who would live in, say, a Hong Kong-style urban core in Melbourne. So the other alternative is to bring public transport to the city, to where people live and work. And that means bringing it to the outer areas of places like Melbourne and Sydney, and doing it really effectively and efficiently, and connecting it to networks of pedestrian paths, bike paths, so that we can extend the range of public transport to make it easier for people to get to public transport. Freight transport is going to be very important for the future. Freight transport, we can't do without freight transport. And when we talk about sustainable transport, we tend to think more or less of passengers. But that's only half the problem. Freight transport is the other half, so we have to find solutions for more sustainable freight transport. One part of that, in terms of intercity transport, must be to get more freight travelling by rail. So rail can be electricity can be renewable fueled. So the future of intercity freight is certainly much more by rail. Get the trucks off the road. For one thing, that'll make roads safer, but it'll also reduce the carbon impact. Well, I think if it means radical change to the urban form, that's not going to happen. Really, we're going to live with low-density cities in Australia for a very long time, and I think a lot of people want that. But that does mean we have to change our transport systems, quite radically, in fact. See, the global dilemma of mobility means that over 50 years, we have to move Australian transport systems, particularly passenger transport and freight systems, to something close to zero carbon emissions. So what is a sustainable transport system? It's one in which greenhouse emissions from transport and infrastructure are reduced to a level that will stabilise the global climate at no more than 2 degrees of warming. It will be a socially fair transport system in which every part of a city has access to good public transport and safe walking and cycling paths. What would a sustainable transport system then be like? It'll be powered by electricity, generated by renewable energy and not fossil fuels. There'll be electric cars and vans, but most commuter traffic in cities will use top quality public transport. Trains, buses, trams, light rail, cycling and walking will be planned to deliver the maximum benefit to personal mobility and safety and efficient movement of goods. Where new roads, railways and footways are needed, they'll be planned as a single network to implement the vision of sustainable transport. The Zurich system, serving a more dispersed suburban area than Melbourne's, provides simple integrated timetables for railways and buses,
well-designed train-bus interchanges, walking and cycle paths joining up stations, residential and commercial areas. And it does this at half the cost per passenger kilometre of Melbourne's public transport. Perth has built 2 new railway lines in the last 20 years, integrating buses and trains.
That Australia is not a small emitter. Australia exports massive amounts of coal, for one thing, and that has to be taken into account. Australia is an important player on the world scene. Australia has a seat on the Security Council now. Australia is very influential in the developed world, and what Australia does, people take note of. So if Australia changes, that will set an example for places like Canada, even for the United States. So what we do counts. But it will require a lot of investment, and new investment, but that could be good for the economy. We need new investment in new technologies, in the sense that, in a way, public transport is old technology, but we need new investment in the top quality public transport and top quality management, top quality signalling, for example, top quality service, which is a bit new. You know, we don't want a 19th century transport system run on 19th century principles. We want 21st century quality public transport. Well, I think Australia is in a very good position to do that. There's plenty of solar, there's geothermal, wave energy, wind energy. What we need to start looking at is baseload power fueled by renewable sources, renewable baseload power. Now, governments tend to think that that's not possible, but it is. It's been proven to be possible. So that's what needs to be explored.
What will building effective and sustainable transport mean for Melbourne? We must immediately start to fill the 50-year backlog of investment in public transport. We have to build the Doncaster rail line, the Rowville rail line, the Melton line electrification, the Cranbourne East rail extension, the Epping North railway extension, the Mernda rail extension, a new railway station at Caroline Springs. The Auditor-General of Victoria says that all this can be done for less than the cost of the eastern section of the proposed east-west road tunnel. Building this road tunnel will lock Melbourne into a future of increased congestion and destruction of our city parks and urban neighbourhoods. Each new motorway brings more congestion to city streets. Our research shows that the promises made for CityLink, that the toll road would speed up traffic, were never fulfilled. Traffic now moves slower than ever, despite billions of additional dollars being spent on the motorways and ramps. Why? Because Melbourne has grown. Melbourne is growing towards 5 million people, a city nearly the size of metropolitan London, but without London's underground. And while Melbourne is still thinking motorways, London gave that up years ago and is building Crossrail, a vast new fast underground railway from outer west to outer east London, moving 24 trains per hour through the central sections. To meet the needs of a city of 5 million, Melbourne must, in addition to completing the rail and tram systems, rationalise its bus routes and integrate them with rail timetables, build new intermodal transit stations, build the east-west rail metro tunnels. Between cities, we need a new inland railway linking Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. This would move passengers at high speed, and it should be built to enable freight to be moved along the eastern seaboard at 50% lower cost than truck transport.
We need governments to take the lead. We can't expect individuals to get on their bikes and somehow solve the problem. We can't expect individuals to suddenly take to public transport and thereby solve the problem. That's not going to happen. We need governments to act. It's not a matter which can be solved by individuals. What we all need to do is to organise. We need to be informed about climate change. We really need to read the science. But the important thing is to get across to governments what we want for the future, that we want a safe world for our future. We want a better public transport system for our cities. And we must have it. And we want to get that across to governments so they really take that seriously. Now, I know that many people in our cities do want exactly that. They do fear climate change. And the means of getting it across to government is perhaps what's lacking a bit. We don't have enough action. We don't have the sort of moratorium marches that we had back in the 1970s against the Vietnam War. We need to tackle climate change in that way. We need to mobilise. We need to get out there into the community, get the community on side, join organisations, talk to friends, talk to people we meet and communicate with, and above all, persuade government. We need to get out there and persuade our politicians, our government leaders, to hear our voice. We need our voice to be heard.